One of the things, though, that I want to acknowledge that I think is a part of the conversation is that some people don't have a trace or a path to follow to go back to a culture or a ethnicity or that, right? Like I said, the tartans, the plaid, the kilts, the weapons, the leather, the leather work, the different games and stuff. I know what Irishness and Scottishness is.
Right.
There are people who are, let's say, Black or Hispanic or Native who don't have any tie back to where that comes from. That is a void in their lives.
Sure.
And that was robbed of them. We had mentioned earlier that some people were brought over to America as property, as economic goods.
Yes.
They don't have that tie back to the my culture, my place, my people. They're lacking that. They don't, that's been robbed of them. And because its absence is more profound than its presence, they're trying to fill it with something. There's going to be a my culture. Those cultures who have been robbed of their cultures oftentimes are the ones who are going to be kind of relegated to a margin, and something that emerged from that being marginalized and having no backdrop of the my culture, that there's nothing robust behind it. Something fills the gaps. Just to acknowledge the fact, because I don't think that it's acknowledged as readily or realistically as it could be.
Sure.
That some people don't have what I have, not because they don't have a culture, but because they don't have any connection to it. What is it? What is it that they're filling that gap with? Is not all of the facets of that culture that made it beautiful in its expression. Instead, it's merely the surface tension of my skin tone and how I look, the way I talk, and familial in-group on a very localized sense.
Or they're filling it with the narrative of how my culture was stolen from me in the first place.
Right. Being robbed is now that culture. You're exactly right. Yes. Being robbed of culture is now my culture. I don't necessarily blame the person for feeling that way if that's the experience that they have. I don't necessarily blame them for identifying with that, because that's actually part of reality. It did happen. It is real, right? How is it that we go about remedying the conversation for this person, acknowledging the fact, yes, culture was robbed. That was wrong. In its absence, some other thing has to be, some other thing has to be erected in its place. What is it that we should be offering them to fill that gap? Right? In some obvious platitude sort of way, we can say, give them the gospel. Right?
Sure.
How do we use our Jesus, who is the Jesus of every man, to fill that hole that their culture has been robbed?
Well, I think one is by displaying compassion that Jesus would have displayed for the individual, for those of us who have been robbed of our culture and things of that nature, recognizing that what happened, acknowledging it. You don't have to apologize for it because you weren't the one that took it, right? But it just acknowledging what took place and leaving space for that. Like, no, this happened, and let's pause. It happened, and let's sit with that, right? And then after we've acknowledged it and we've sat with it, we say, okay, now let's acknowledge what we filled the space with. We filled the space with the narrative of victimization, of oppression, and so on and so forth, and even hatred toward those toward those who look like those who stole the culture from us, right? And acknowledge that, leave space for that, and then say, okay, we need to do away with what we filled the space with, and we need to replace it with something else. We need a new narrative, because the narrative that we have doesn't work for us. We need to fill this space with a new narrative. Well, what's the new narrative we can fill it with? Well, the new narrative we can fill it with is that even the ones who look like the people that took the culture from us are image bearers of the living God, just like we are, made in his image and likeness to do the same things that we're called to do, which is love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. Those people that look like the ones that stole the culture, those are the neighbors. What do we do with this Jesus who we claim to love and worship, and we go to church every Sunday and sing about and praise and everything in that sort. What do we do with this guy who gives a parable of the Good Samaritan? When we study that and think that through and understand all the racial context around that conversation that took place, right? If Jesus were giving the Good Samaritan conversation to a group of Black people, it would sound like the Good Caucasian, right? Yeah. And,
Yeah. Oh
and,
man.
and we go and Jesus at the end tells us to go and behave like the Good Caucasian. What are we going to do with this guy? And if he was given the same parable to a group of white people, he may call it the good black person, the good African American. And at the end of this parable, he tells this group of Caucasians, this group of white supremacists, hey, go behave like the African American that you persecute. So we have to challenge ourselves to acknowledge what happened, but not be identified by what happened, and replace the victim narrative that we have identified ourselves by. Don't get rid of it in terms of its history. Don't forget it, but remove it from the place of identity and replace that with what Christ says about you and what Christ thinks about you. And when I do that, I'll find myself having to engage the very people that I've discriminated against or that discriminate against me.